Before I hand it over to Medina, I would like to introduce one of our colleagues from Help Me Grow. Her name is Tola Sefi. She will give us a little bit of context as how we came about with this presentation. Tola.
Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Tolo. I'm from Help Me Grow. I'm the community liaison and kind of wanted to give a little background of how this training came to fruition. In the past year, I've met with many of you from different agencies, and kind of the same request I got is around wanting a training around cultural humility around Afghans and how to better serve the clients that you're working with. And it took a long time coming, but we finally found Medina, and she's going to give you guys a great presentation on how to better serve and kind of understand who we are as Afghans, how we got here, kind of give some context of the Afghans that came here 30 years ago and versus the Afghans that are now recently coming, because as most of you know, Alameda County is home to one of the largest Afghan populations in the United States. And so chances are you're going to be touching with this population very soon if you haven't yet already. And it's great that you're here. I'm going to pass it back to Catherine to kind of introduce Medina and get ready for this presentation.
Thank you, Tolo. So Medina Wardak is a social worker, consultant, trainer, and facilitator based out of Los Angeles, California. She received a bachelor's in political science with an emphasis on the Middle East from UC Irvine and a master's in social work from the University of Southern California. She has served foster youth experiencing housing instability since 2018 at both Covenant House, California, and First Place for Youth. She has previously served as a facilitator for various workshops at the Afghan American Conference regarding identity, mental health, and substance abuse. Medina also serves as a trainer and facilitator, consulting social services agencies serving Afghan refugees. She is the founder of Burkas and Beer and an online digital platform discussing Afghan mental health, intergenerational trauma, political issues, identity, and social cultural events. You can find more about Medina and her work on her website. And let me introduce you to Medina Wardak.
Thanks so much, Catherine and Tolo and Leah and First Five for putting this together. I understand a lot of folks were asking for this training. There has been a really big change kind of, in the way that Afghan folks are coming to the States, especially since the most recent Taliban takeover. So I do hope that this training is helpful for some of y'all who are working with Afghan folks. So I will go ahead and screen share now. Alrighty. And can I get a thumbs up to make sure that everyone can see that screen? Awesome. Alrighty, so I will try my absolute best to be concise today, but please pardon me if I get too passionate about what we're talking about. You will see me looking off screen, and that's just because I have two screens up. So what we'll go over today is some of the historical context, a brief overview of the past 50 or so years. And then on the other side of the coin, we're also going to talk about what is the essence of being an Afghan and how this can inform your practice, whether it comes to mental health, substance abuse, social services, whether you're a volunteer, whether you are a mental health practitioner, and how can that inform your work, right? So if you have a deeper understanding of Afghanistan and its people, then you might have a better insight into the help-seeking behaviors, the cultural norms, and the attitudes of how Afghans move throughout the world. So this can also help you understand the geopolitical and cultural realities that our community is navigating. So what are we going to be doing today? For our learning objectives, we will be defining cultural humility, talking about how cultural humility differs from cultural competence, identifying the unique cultural background experiences of Afghan folks and how war and displacement can impact mental health. We're going to be discussing common challenges that are faced by practitioners and professionals when working with Afghan families. And then we'll also be developing practical skills and strategies to promote cultural humility and improve cultural competence when working with Afghan folks. So we're going to go ahead and move into our first poll. So when you are referring to a person from Afghanistan, the correct term is Afghani. Is that true or false? Awesome. We have about 50-50 here. We can go ahead and end that poll. So the correct answer is false. When you're referring to a person from Afghanistan, the correct term is Afghan, right? So Afghani refers to our money. When you're talking about a person from Afghanistan, you would refer to them as an Afghan. Can you guys see the poll popping up? Sorry, let me remove that. All right. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask that we think about this question. What are some preconceived notions that we hold about Afghan people? Afghanistan has been in the media for decades, mainly through the lens of war and mainly through the literal lens of Western photographers. So throughout the presentation, I've included a lot of visuals to foster a deeper reflection of Afghanistan and its people. As you take in the images, just ponder and think about your own assumptions and attitudes towards Afghans. This can have a very profound effect on how we show up for our clients. Our own preconceived notions can impact what we believe about their resilience, about their grit, their agency, and their capacity. So humility versus competence, right? When we're talking about cultural competence, this is a categorical knowledge that a person could attain about a group of people. Sometimes this can lead to stereotyping and bias because we might be assuming that, you know, the one case vignette or the one study that you learned about Afghan folks is going to be applicable to all Afghan folks. And this can, you know, be applicable to any community, right? When we're coming from a culturally humble lens, we're recognizing that this is a lifelong process and it will constantly be challenged, and that no two people from one community are going to be alike. It can be helpful to like understand overarching themes and you know, cultural norms and lenses and things like that. But cultural humility is also acknowledging that there's going to be intersecting identities, and that can always inform a person's experience, especially when it comes to Afghans, because we are such a diverse people. So who am I? I'm the daughter of Afghan refugees who escaped the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and fled into Pakistan. From there, my parents, along with both of my sisters, came to the States in the late 80s, and I was born right here in California soon after that. The wave of migration that my family belongs to, and probably Tolo's family also, is considered the first like real migration of Afghans to America. Of course, you had folks coming before that, but the mass exodus of Afghans in the 80s is where we're seeing communities of Afghan Americans beginning to like build. I received my BA from UC Irvine in political science with an emphasis on the Middle East, and my master's in social work. And the trajectory of where I am today is really shaped by my family and my community's experience as refugees. Growing up, I was really aware of the intersections of mental health and foreign policy because I saw it play out in my own community. Specifically in my immediate and my extended family, I witnessed the material impacts of war. This included substance abuse, suicide, and poor mental and physical health outcomes. And we know that all this is like inextricably linked, right? Like mental health is going to inform physical health, and it's a cycle. What I was also witness to was a community that was so sick, but had really no way of seeking help. There was such a void and a disconnect between the Afghan community and the existing medical, mental, and social service institutions in America. So I wanted to be a part of the solution of kind of addressing that gap. So these are my parents. They grew up in what was considered Afghanistan's quote unquote golden age. So my mom was an accountant and my father was a hydrologist. My mom studied in Russia and my dad studied here in the States. Both were a part of a generation of Afghans who were really excited. Afghanistan at that time was experiencing rapid modernization and social change. And you'll see in the next couple of slides some examples of that. Up until the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan actually had one of the highest freedom of press rates. So it enjoyed uncensored media and press. And during the time between 1919 and 1979, all of these realities existed simultaneously, where there were folks who were living in rural Afghanistan that might have had very different experiences from the major cities, but Afghanistan was really a place that, and still is, but was a place that was full of a lot of hope. And there was rapid modernization, a lot of attention, being put into the country. A lot of folks were going abroad to study. And so you'll see through these photos, magazines were coming to Afghanistan to take super cool pictures. These photos are from when Life magazine came to Afghanistan, and these photos were taken by Fred Maroon. And the fashion in Afghanistan was really reflective of the fashion of that time. What many people don't know is that the famous 1960s, 1970s sheepskin coat actually comes from Afghanistan. It was quote unquote discovered by the Beatles, but it really is just a traditional Afghan coat, which I love finding those in vintage stores. You can still find them around. And that's because during this time, there was vast cultural exchange, right? So this was the era of the hippie trail, as it's known. And so you can see kind of the way that it starts, right? So a lot of folks were going from London, from Europe, and then going into Asia to end up in South Asia and East Asia. And again, because during this time, it was relatively safe for folks to travel throughout the region. And so these are just other photos of Westerners who traveled through Afghanistan. This is a photo of Sophia Tarzi, who was actually a member of the royal family and a pretty prominent fashion designer. These are some photos of my sisters. So going back to that historical context and the relationship between Afghanistan and the world, I really felt that just in my family, right? Because my sisters were born there and raised there, and I was born here and raised here. It was interesting growing up as the only child in my family who didn't experience living and fleeing Afghanistan. Growing up as an Afghan in the 90s was super interesting because up until 9/11, Afghans were seen as heroes. Afghans were seen as the people who kicked out the Russians, the people that single-handedly crumbled the Soviet Union, right? Afghans were seen as heroes. Because beginning in 1979, the world united in support of the Afghan people in their fight against communism. So this poster that you see here is, it was published in 1981 from Fortune magazine. And what it's asking for donations to support the Afghan Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviet Union. So for Afghans, this, seeing what's happening in Ukraine is very much a deja vu, because what is happening in Ukraine is pretty much what was happening, in the 70s and the 80s for Afghan folks, where the entire world was pooling in money to support Afghans fighting communism. So this is how vast the USSR was at that time. So you can see it's covering a lot of the northern Central Asian states across the Caspian Sea. So going back to that golden era of Afghanistan, that's where you start to see political turmoil beginning. Communism is taking its hold in Asia. And in Afghanistan, you had a lot of political groups who were very sympathetic to the Russian cause. Earlier, when I mentioned that there was such high freedom of press, Afghanistan was the place where you could at that time, there was a lot of space and a lot of dialogue for folks of all different political spectrums to discuss their issues and to organize. And one of those groups that was really sympathetic to the Russian cause was the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. So their beliefs included land redistribution, education of women, separation of church and state. And it was split into two factions. One faction was called Khalq, and another faction was called Parcham. And so essentially these were, what most folks refer to as Afghan communists. Although there were other communist parties at the time, this is like the main one, right? And so their pamphlets, would say things like the party struggles against imperialism, particularly American imperialism and its ally, Maoism. So the PDPA really formed in the 70s. During this golden era of Afghanistan, it was Zahir Shah who was the leader of Afghanistan. So he's the last monarch of Afghanistan. And what he tried to do was he tried to eliminate nepotism in the country, which essentially meant that all of his family members who had, prominent positions in the government were now ousted from their positions of power, which pissed off a lot of people. And one of those people that it pissed off was his cousin Dawood Khan. So Zahir Shah's cousin Dawood Khan ended up, conducting a coup and took the country over. So now you're seeing this shifting of power from the monarch Zahir Shah, who led a relatively long, peaceful time in Afghanistan, to his cousin now coming in and taking control of the country in a coup. And this is kind of where you start to see rumblings of what you see now, right? There's a lot of uncertainty during this time. Even though a lot of people supported Dawood Khan because he was abolishing the monarchy, the Afghan communists felt like his position wasn't strong enough because he had a position of neutrality. He did not want to get involved in, communism versus capitalism. He wanted to make sure that Afghanistan remained neutral. Another thing that he also tried to do was he attempted to take the southern portion of what was Afghanistan back. So after the partition of India, and I don't want to ramble here, but after the partition of India, what happened was the country of Pakistan was formed and the southern portion of Afghanistan was absorbed into the Pakistani state. And the reason that this is really important is because this is directly how the Taliban is formed, and we'll come to that. So in 1978, Dawood Khan is overthrown by the PDPA, and the Afghan communists come into power. And the Afghan communists led a very bloody campaign. So there's a quote that between April 1978 and the Soviet invasion in December 1979, Afghan communists executed 27,000 political prisoners in Policharkhi, which was a prison outside of Kabul. Many of the victims were village mullahs and headmen who were obstructing the modernization and secularization of the intensely religious Afghan countryside. By Western standards, this was a salutary idea in the abstract, but it was carried out in such a violent way that it alarmed even the Soviets. So imagine during this time, the PDPA takes over and it's Afghan communists who are exhibiting a lot of violence against other Afghan folks, right? Geopolitically, what's happening while this is all happening in Afghanistan? So Pakistan is beginning to really ramp up its influence in Afghanistan. It sees what's happening. It sees that there's anti-Soviet resentment building. And Pakistan wants to make sure, their strategic depth policy, their policy to ensure that their borders are secure. They want to make sure that Afghanistan is so busy fighting itself that it forgets all about the land that Afghanistan lost when Pakistan was formed. And so what we start to see, this general Zia-ul-Haq, he begins to have a lot of support and sympathy towards Afghan rebels and towards anti-Soviet Islamic rebels within the country. So when the Afghan communist takes over, the world begins to pay attention to the anti-Soviet resentment. And Afghanistan is now seen as the perfect battleground for communism versus capitalism. And this is where we see Operation Cyclone. What is Operation Cyclone? This is the CIA code name for a project to arm and finance the Mujahideen. This is major players coming together to finance this resistance. And this project, Operation Cyclone, is spearheaded by Ronald Reagan in what is known as the Reagan Doctrine. But this is really a concerted effort between the British MI6, between the Pakistani ISI, between the American CIA, and there's also less support from the Israeli Mossad, Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran. What is the strategy of Operation Cyclone? The strategy is to indoctrinate anti-Soviet, pro-Islamist policy in the region. So a lot of money went into a propaganda campaign. Some of this propaganda was created right here in the University of Nebraska, where there was a mass production of anti-Soviet propaganda. So these pamphlets are being created and literally dropped from helicopters overhead to Afghans on the ground. And this is when you see the Mujahideen being formed. The Mujahideen is not one political rebel group. It's really a loose formation of anti-Soviet rebel fighters, right? When we're referring to the Taliban, they're really like one cohesive group. Mujahideen is kind of just an overarching term for like this loose federation of folks who are anti-Soviet. And a lot of these folks were trained in Pakistan and were funded by these Operation Cyclone leaders. So they're going into Pakistan, they're getting trained, and then they're coming back into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Like I mentioned, there were, consisted of numerous groups that differed from each other. Sometimes these groups differed based on linguistic or ethnic identity, and we'll get into the vast diversity of Afghan folks in a little bit. But all of these groups were united in their anti-communist ideals and their pro-Islamic goals. So as the world is turning its attention to Afghanistan, and as Afghan rebels are receiving sympathy for fighting communism, so enters the picture Osama bin Laden. OBL joins in the fight against the Soviet occupation or the Soviet Union. And he joins this fight against the Soviet Union with CIA-funded weapons. So this is an article from 1993 in The Independent that is essentially praising Osama bin Laden as an anti-Soviet warrior. He was seen as one of the leaders that was really championing this cause against the Soviet Union. So then what happens? The Soviets are defeated by the Mujahideen. They retreat. This defeat really begins the beginning of the crumbling of the Soviet Union. So Afghans and Afghanistan have successfully ended the Soviet Union. But what else retreats? All of the funding and support that Afghanistan was receiving. So the Americans, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, they all close up their briefcases and they say, okay, thank you for your service. We got the USSR to fall. You did what we wanted you to do, and we're out. Good luck figuring it out. Good luck figuring out how to nation build. Afghanistan was turned into a proxy war battleground, resulting in a mass refugee crisis. Millions of Afghans have died. The country's infrastructure from that rapid modernization period under Zahir Shah and Dawood Khan is done. Everything is destroyed. The entire country was essentially levied to the ground from all of this fighting. And it's also littered in landmines. And now multiple rebel groups who still have rifles and stingers and choppers and missiles are now fighting one another because of the power vacuum that has been created. So this is where you see from 1992 until 1996, the Afghan Civil War, where all of these different Mujahideen factions begin to fight each other for power. Some of them are different along ethnic lines. And we also see genocide. We see ethnic groups committing genocide against one another, mass murder, sexual violence. And imagine this is after they were united in this bloody battle to defeat the Soviets. Now they're all fighting each other for control of Afghanistan. And this photo here, just shows what Kabul looked like before and then what Kabul looked like after. And out of this power vacuum, the Taliban emerged victorious. They're one of the many groups during the Civil War who were vying for power. They're made up mainly of orphans and refugees from the Soviet occupation. They mainly grew up in refugee camps in Pakistan, and they were recruited and funded by the Pakistani ISI. The Pakistani ISI is the Pakistani equivalent of the CIA. When the Taliban first came into power in 1996, they were welcomed. They were seen as doves of peace. That's what they were called. That's how badly the country was suffering. Because the Taliban came in and with an iron fist, with draconian power, they actually stopped the fighting. Women were not being harassed in the streets. Crime completely plummeted. And this was not because the Taliban knew how to govern, it's because they were so terrifying that the fighting completely stopped. The burqa was mandated, which a lot of folks tend to think that the burqa was, mandated because it was some type of religious interpretation. Yes, that's a big part of it, but it was actually a response to the use of rape as a tool of war. And so the Talib said, put this burqa on and don't go anywhere without men, because at that time, there was so much sexual violence occurring against women. And one of the ways that the ideology of the Taliban was maintained and is maintained is by the very propaganda pamphlets that were used by the US to radicalize the Mujahideen. So essentially, American foreign policy created the Taliban. Imagine the Taliban are using those pamphlets that were created in the University of Nebraska to train themselves, right? In terms of the remaining history, I'm going to assume that you know it more or less. The SparkNotes version, right, is that the Taliban allow Osama bin Laden to stay in Afghanistan. And from there, he's given sanctuary and a command center to plan the 9/11 attacks, right? So one thing that is also important to keep in mind is that the reason Osama bin Laden was given safe haven in Afghanistan is because of one of the tenets of Pashtunwali, which is considered, the Pashtun Code of Honor, and we'll go more into that as well. So Operation Enduring Freedom is the name of the operation to, essentially go into Afghanistan, take out Osama bin Laden, take out the Taliban, and bring back, some type of form of democracy into the country, right? I actually remember when Operation Enduring Freedom started, they televised the dropping of the bombs on Afghanistan. And so for the Afghan folks that had left during, my parents' generation, it was extremely traumatizing to see their country being bombed on national television. And the reason that I talk a lot about this and the reason that I bring this up is, going back to that first slide where we discussed what are your preconceived notions about Afghans? Because there has been such a conflation of Afghans in the media equaling war, equaling trauma, equaling the burqa, equaling all of these images that we can all replay in our mind because we know it so well. How is that going to inform your practice when you're working with folks who are just coming now? And how does that also inform the way that you are navigating spaces where first and second generation Afghans like myself and Tolo and other folks whose parents came in the 80s and 90s, how are we even navigating our identities around Americans, right? I can speak for myself when I tell someone I'm Afghan, I'm anticipating something. I don't just say I'm Afghan. I'm like, I'm Afghan. Like, what are they going to say? What are they going to say? Are they going to say something ignorant? Are they going to say something welcoming? This is in the back of the minds of most Afghan folks, especially now that Afghanistan is once again in the media, it's kind of this revival, right? A very, essentially what I call like Afghan phobic rhetoric. And so when these families are coming over here, just kind of thinking about, they might be thinking about that as well. And especially with this most recent migration that's coming, if they stayed in Afghanistan up until 2021, they've endured 40 years of war, right? My parents got out early. I mean, they saw 10 years, right? It's still super traumatizing, still, of course, very traumatizing. But for the folks that stayed, I mean, they experienced the Soviet occupation. They experienced the Afghan Civil War. They experienced Taliban 1.0, the American occupation, and now Taliban 2.0. That's 5 turning of hands of power. Okay, poll time. If we can please pull up a poll. So I don't expect that y'all will have this answer off the top of your head, but the question is, the Afghan constitution recognizes how many ethnic groups? So the correct answer is 14 ethnic groups. And we will go into all of the different ethnic groups and languages and religions in a little bit. Okay, let's talk about the Taliban. They are made up mainly of Pashtun folks, but you will find other ethnic groups in the mix. They are Sunni Orthodox Muslim. They specifically follow what is known as Deobandi. It's a school of thought within Islam. Deobandi school of thought is taught in madrasas in Pakistan. Madrasas are religious schools. And so this is a radical interpretation of Quranic texts. So the type of school of thought that the Taliban believe in and preach is a very draconian and literal interpretation of the texts within this geopolitical context of war, right? Taliban ideology cannot exist without the presence of war because it is so rooted in this belief that Islam and the creation of an Islamic emirate is what's going to keep Muslim people safe from the West, right? I always tell people, people like my parents and maybe Tolo's parents and folks from our generation, they don't get the Taliban, they don't get it. And the reason that they don't get it is because that type of ideology would have never thrived under the reign of Zahir Shah and under the reign of Dawood Khan. This is something that's very foreign for a lot of Afghans who grew up in a relatively peaceful Afghanistan, right? The only reason that this ideology has been able to thrive and the reason that it's so successful and the reason that we saw the Taliban once again take over the country is because they can't exist without war. Their number one recruiting tool is war. Their number one recruiting tool is orphans, people whose parents have died from the past 40 years of war. So this photo, I'm sure a lot of folks here can identify this photo. This image is of a little girl who's now a grown woman. At the time that this photo was taken, she was 12 years old and her name is Sharbat Gola. The photo was taken in a refugee camp in Pakistan in 1984 by Steve McCurry. She was never asked if she wanted her photo taken. She was never asked her name. And this photo catapulted McCurry's career. And not one penny went to Sharbat Gola. As a matter of fact, she was even arrested at one point in Pakistan because she was using a fake ID, a fake national ID. And even years later, she still hadn't received her papers in Pakistan. When she was asked how she felt about her photo being one of the most recognized on earth, she said that it made her sad. So think about that. This is so much the story of the Afghan people. So many things happening to us without our permission, right? So much taken from us. Afghans didn't ask for this. Afghans didn't ask for, to be identified and to be labeled as one of the largest refugee groups on earth. Afghans didn't ask for the return of the Taliban. A lot of folks will say things like, well, this is what the Afghans wanted. Well, when between a rock and a hard place, between the American occupation and the Taliban occupation, some Afghans did prefer it, which we'll go into a little deeper down the line. Most people don't imagine that their lives will be uprooted by war. So as we move through the rest of the presentation, I would just like for you to keep that in mind. And again, just to think about what comes up for you when you hear the phrase Afghan refugee. Okay. So Afghanistan as a country. So here's a photo of Afghanistan. Here's the photo of the different provinces in Afghanistan. It's a landlocked country, meaning that we don't have access to like major bodies of water besides our own rivers and lakes, which there are plenty. So there is plenty of water resources within the country, but it's landlocked. It's multilingual, it's multi-ethnic, and it is multi-religious, although now it's overwhelmingly Islamic. So what does this mean? This means that your clients and the folks that you work with might speak different languages, and they might be fluent in more than one Afghan language, or they might only know one Afghan language, right? It's pretty typical that folks can speak both the national languages, Pashto and Farsi, but you might come across folks that maybe only speak Uzbeki, for instance. So like I mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that it's dominated by Sunni Islam, and it also has a very long history of Sufism. Sufism is the esoteric or the spiritual leg of Islam. So think like Rumi, think whirling dervishes. There's a really strong culture of Sufi poetry that comes from Afghanistan. Afghanistan was once known as the land of the Sufi saints. So there's a very rich history of that in our country. This is a photo of some of the different ethnic groups that you'll find in Afghanistan. The country is estimated to have around 38 million people. It's important. So there's you'll find a lot of these different numbers online, but it's important to remember that there hasn't really been an accurate census in decades, because it's really tough to conduct an accurate census, especially in a place like Afghanistan that's so geographically diverse also. We have rivers, mountains, desert, you name it. So it's kind of hard to give an accurate number, but we can more or less estimate that this is correct. So estimated to have around 38 million people. It's roughly the size of Texas, okay? The major ethnic groups, in order of their supposed size, begins with the Pashtuns, which I am an ethnic Pashtun, Tajiks, Hazaras, Turkmens, Uzbek, Aimak, Nuristani, Pashai, Kizilbach, Baloch, among others. There are other smaller groups also. The two main languages are Pashto and Dari. It's important to note that Dari is mainly a term to identify Afghan Farsi. That's all it really is. There are differences in terms of words, dialect, but essentially they're the same language. So when you're thinking about British English and American English, that's kind of the analogy that we like to use when we talk about like Iranian Farsi and Afghan Dari. As a matter of fact, when you're learning formal quote unquote Iranian Farsi, it's much closer to Afghan Dari. Because of the geography of Afghanistan, we've been able to retain the older form of the language. So those two languages are mutually intelligible, meaning that more or less Iranians and Afghans can understand each other. But if you have a client that has like, they need translation services and you have the option of using a Dari speaker or a Farsi speaker, always go for the Dari speaker. Because there have been times where you're missing vital information because you're having an Iranian translator who just doesn't know some of the regional dialect, some of the regional words. So it's always, of course, imperative to go with Dari if you can. A lot of your clients may know other languages from the surrounding region. A lot of Afghans happen to know Hindi and Urdu because we watch so much Bollywood, okay? So I have aunts who are fluent in Hindi and Urdu just because they watch Bollywood. Afghans are really good at picking up languages because it's a multilingual country. We kind of have like a tongue for that. It's easy for us to pick up surrounding languages. So they might know Hindi, they might know Urdu, they might know Balochi. And then if they're SIV holders, they will like 75%, 80%, they're gonna know English also. So they're usually like, you might get lucky and you might get somebody in the family who knows English. In terms of the religions of Afghanistan, like I've mentioned, it's overwhelmingly a Sunni Muslim country. But historically speaking, the country was multi-religious. We have a very strong Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh heritage, and Zoroastrian heritage. And we have had communities of Jewish folks and Baha'i folks, and there are some Christian folks in Afghanistan as well. Okay. Here's a map showing you more or less the ethnic makeup of the country. So as you can see from the map, there is some reflection of geography and ethnic identity. However, you are going to see small, like little groups scattered throughout. So like if you look at the Pashtun folks that are in light green, most Pashtun folks are along the southern tribal belt, but you'll see pockets in the north. And this was intentionally done, right? During the reign of one of our kings, named Abdurrahman Khan, there was a forceful migration of Pashtuns to the north and Tajiks to the south. And what he was attempting to do was kind of, an egg scramble of the ethnic identities in Afghanistan so that you could never partition the country based on ethnic lines. So this is an intentional thing, right? These groups have coexisted for centuries, but as mentioned previously when we were talking about the Civil War and Afghanistan just being the center of Asia, sometimes these groups have been in competition with one another for land and resources. And they may still have contentious issues. So when you're working with your clients, it's always important to keep this in mind, that being Afghan is not one experience. And it can be really heavily impacted and shaped by your ethnic origin, by your tribal affiliation, by your religious sect, and by your, language identity as well, amongst other markers, right? Those aren't the only markers. So talking about the geostrategic location of Afghanistan. Over the millennia, Afghanistan has seen a number of invaders come through the area and leave the mark on our culture. One of the reasons controlling the region of Afghanistan has been so important to these waves of conquerors is because of our geostrategic location. As you can see in the map, it's a natural corridor for conquerors and traders moving goods from west to east and vice versa. And it's the geographical door into India. So it's always been like a really coveted spot to kind of have your, tanks and your bases and whatever, what have you. Okay, poll time. So we have two separate questions here. We just went over Afghan ethnic groups. So which of the following is not an Afghan ethnic group? A, the Pashtuns, B, the Uzbeks, C, the Imaks, or D, the Kurds? I'm hoping for that poll to come up. So Kurds are not an Afghan ethnic group. Although we share a lot of cultural similarities with Kurds, Kurds also celebrate Nowruz, which is the Zoroastrian New Year. There are no existing communities of Kurds in Afghanistan. And that second question, which of the following is not a language you would interpret for Afghan refugee? It's likely, I mean, it's possible that, there are some Afghans who speak Arabic, but it's not likely. Farsi and Pashto, like we said, are the national languages, and Uzbek is also a common language. So unless, there's Afghan folks who have gone over to like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab states, it's likely that you're not going to be translating in Arabic. Okay. So, and by the way, we will have time for a break. It is coming up soon. I know that this is a lot of information. So just keeping that in mind. So who is an Afghan, right? What has that term historically mean? How does ethnicity function in the country and in the diaspora? And what types of issues might you actually run into? So the term Afghan for much of history was synonymous with the word Pashtun. So those words were used interchangeably. But when the nation state and the borders of Afghanistan were beginning to form, there was a very intentional push to create a national identity under the umbrella term Afghan. So that means that the word changed from just being associated with Pashtuns to now everyone within the borders of Afghanistan is an Afghan. This is a kind of like a recent development, right? Like the idea of a nation state is pretty new. The idea of a nation state in general is relatively new, but with Afghanistan, a little less than 200 years. So you might have clients who are from the borders of Afghanistan, but don't refer to themselves as Afghan. They may say, oh no, I'm Tajik, or I'm Hazara, or I'm Sikh, or I'm Hindu, whatever it is. It's not typical, but it does happen. And it's a reflection of ethnic communities from Afghanistan choosing to identify with their ethnic group over their nationality. Again, I've seen this happen. I've seen folks who are like, no, I don't identify as an Afghan. I identify as an Afghanistani, which is, a term that I've heard recently. And we want to empower those folks to identify how they want to identify, right? This is kind of a contentious issue within the Afghan diaspora, right? There's all these online battles and things like that. And sorry, I think my neighbor's dogs are barking, excuse that. But we do want to recognize and empower our clients' agency, especially when so much has been taken from them. I have seen Afghan practitioners who are of a certain ethnic group upset that this family from Afghanistan doesn't want to identify as Afghan. We'll go a little bit deeper into the reasons why people might not want to identify that way. And, to each their own, and we want to empower that. And that's why it's important to, to have a training like this. And that's why I'm so happy that y'all are here, because it's such a nuanced conversation and it's such a nuanced identity. I'll give you guys like a very, I'll try to keep this short. I know we're already an hour in, but a funny story. My family is Pashtun, although I do have a great grandmother who is Hazara, but we mainly identify as Pashtun. And my aunt, when she met her husband, when he was courting her, she heard him speak Dari, she heard him speak Farsi. And she said, I can't marry you. I can only marry an Afghan. She said this in Afghanistan. She said, I can only marry an Afghan. And he recognized that she meant she can only marry a Pashtun. But he's one step ahead of her and he said, oh no, but I am Afghan. And he was technically Afghan. He has Afghan nationality. And then when he came to ask for my aunt's hands and my grandma saw that everyone was speaking Farsi, she's like, wait a minute, he's not Pashtun. Why did you say that? I give that story as an example to say that identity is still something that's really nuanced amongst Afghans. More or less, folks will identify as Afghan, but this is just important for you to keep in mind and for you to know. Okay, moving on. So the idea of who an Afghan is very much influenced by this border that you see here in between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That border is called the Durand Line border. It was signed and officially created in 1893. It cuts right across the Pashtun ethnic group. Okay, so the Pashtun people have effectively been chopped in half. Half of us are in Pakistan and half of us are in Afghanistan. This is why it was so easy for Afghans to flee into Pakistan during that first migration of Afghans outside of Afghanistan, because the Afghan government does not formally recognize that border. To the Afghan government, that border doesn't exist. We don't recognize it. It's not real. It's not a real thing for us. That's why it's that's why there's such an easy smuggling of drugs, goods, weapons, what have you, across that border, because it's extremely difficult. It's almost a suicide mission for the Pakistani government to try to secure that border, because the Pashtun tribes along that border won't allow it to happen, right? So keeping that in mind, that's why it's been so easy for Afghans to flee into Pakistan. All right, let's talk about the different Afghan ethnic groups, and then we'll have time for a break. So we've talked a little bit about the Pashtuns. They're considered to be the largest ethnic group in the region. Again, there's no accurate census, so we're not 100% sure, but we can say more or less, yes, that is likely. They are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. And they also have a very large presence in Pakistan. They've maintained political dominance in Afghanistan. They're mainly tribal based, with an estimated 350 to 400 tribes and clans. And the dialect of Pashto can differ depending on where they're from geographically. So the two main dialects of Pashto amongst Afghans, we refer to these as Pakhto or Pashto, the kha or the sha. So in translation purposes, you're going to be okay if you have someone who speaks Pashto translating for someone who speaks Pakhto, because it's not super different. I'll give you an example. If you're to ask someone who speaks Pashto, how are you? You say Singaye, and they respond to you by either saying Shayam or Khayam. Both of those phrases just mean I'm good. But based on the response of that phrase, you're going to know that that person speaks Pashto or Pakhto. Again, it's not a major difference, but I have encountered Afghans who have a really hard time understanding one dialect over the other. I'm one of them. Because I grew up speaking Pakhto. When I hear Pashto, I have to do mental gymnastics to try to figure out what those words mean. But considering that majority of your clients are going to be straight from Afghanistan and not someone like me who's born and raised here and has to learn, how to speak Pakhto, Farsi, and English, your client should be okay. Okay. Pashtuns typically follow the moral and legal code known as Pashtunwali, as we talked about earlier. And this is mostly followed in rural tribes, but continues to influence Pashtun behavior with an emphasis on honor, loyalty, hospitality, and protection of female relatives. I included a picture of Malala Yousafzai, who many folks identify as a Pakistani here because she is an ethnic Pashtun. And the picture on the lower right-hand corner of that tall fellow standing next to Gandhi is a man named Bacha Khan, who was instrumental during the partition of India. Because there's a very large historical presence of Pashtuns in India. A lot of the Bollywood stars that you see have Pashtun origins. Okay. Earlier, when I was talking to y'all about the recruitment strategies of the Taliban and why their ideology has been given so much strength in such a modern world. Why is that? Why is it that their very draconian, backwards ideology continues to flourish? A big part, so earlier we said Taliban 1.0, that was the children of orphans, but that was orphans from the Soviet occupation, right? That's where you see the first generation of the Taliban. This generation of the Taliban that you're seeing now, which a lot of them are like kids, right? They're like in their 20s. You know, the leaders are older, obviously, but where are we seeing them being recruited from? A big part of Taliban recruitment comes from President Obama's drone warfare. So what happened in 2009, there was a concerted effort to ramp up the way military operations were being conducted in Afghanistan. And one part of this was using drone warfare. This meant that the southern tribal belts really, really suffered heavy military incursions. There's actually a really great article by Anand Gopal, and what I'll do is I'll actually email it over to our lovely folks who've organized this training today. A lot of what Anand Gopal writes about is this drone warfare. And it's very possible that some of your clients, which I've actually heard a lot of folks in Virginia had met and were working with a lot of Southern Pashtun refugees who were victims of drone warfare. When you go to Afghanistan, you know, I went in 2018, I was shocked by the number of amputees. In Kabul, like every third person doesn't have an arm or a leg. It's like wild. That has to do with the landmines from the Soviet occupation. But you will encounter clients who lived under drones. And so there is, you know, kind of a united, concerted effort, especially in Pakistan. There's a political movement called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement that organizes against the use of drone warfare. But it's just important for y'all to keep in mind. People in Kabul were not necessarily running from drones, although it did happen in the end where we saw that poor family get killed by drones, in August 2021. But it's more likely that the folks who've experienced drone warfare are from the southern tribal belt. Now on to Tajik folks. Tajiks are considered the second largest ethnic group, and they speak the Afghan dialect of Farsi known as Dari. They have a very strong poetic history and culture, as exemplified by a number of Farsi-speaking poets, one of which is Rumi, the most famous Tajik, right? We could identify him as a Tajik. Today he would be identified that way because he was born in modern day Afghanistan. So although Pashtuns have maintained political power, Tajiks have been considered the elite of Kabul, and it's their language that's historically used in governmental affairs. So it's very common for other ethnic groups to have the ability to speak Dari because it's historically always been taught in schools. So you might meet like Pashtun folks that know Dari and vice versa, but it's usually more typical for non-Dari speakers to know it. Because one, it's an easier language to learn. Pashto is very difficult. As a lifelong speaker, I can say it's extremely difficult. And two, it's used kind of like as a lingua franca and was used in a lot of governmental affairs. On to Hazara folks. So like I mentioned, my great-grandmother was a Hazara woman. The Hazaras are the third largest ethnic group, and they speak the Hazaragi dialect of Dari. They typically follow Shia Islam, although you will meet Sunni Hazaras. And the unfortunate reality for the Hazara people is their long history of persecution in Afghanistan. The most accepted theory of Hazara origin is that they're descendants of Genghis Khan's army. And possibly because of this supposed origin, they have faced genocide, land theft, and overall disenfranchisement and unfair treatment. One of our kings, Abdurrahman Khan, who I mentioned earlier, who purposely mixed up the ethnic kind of geography of the country, conducted one of the largest genocides against the Hazara people in the late 1800s. He effectively wiped out 60% of their population. Typically, this has been done at the hands of Pashtun leaders, but the Hazara have faced persecution from every single ethnic group in Afghanistan. One of their most recent and large genocides, known as the Afshar massacre, was actually led by Tajik rebels during the Civil War. So Hazara folks have faced persecution from all sides. And another thing that kind of separates them is that they typically look different. It's easy to spot a Hazara person because they look more East Asian. And because they also practice Shia Islam, it's easy to spot them, which makes them a very easy target for persecution. So if you have Hazara Afghan clients, please, please, please keep this history in mind. It's really, really important. Especially like if you have, Pashtun clients and Hazara clients, it's likely that maybe they don't care and they're totally fine with each other. But it could be possible that this comes up, especially now with the recent Taliban takeover. These ethnic, historical arguments and histories are coming to the surface again. We're seeing a revival of ethnic fractures. Even though the Afghan people, I feel like, are a pretty united people, you will see this happening. So being mindful of that can help inform your practice with Afghan refugees. Let's see here. Outside groups have also kind of harped on these differences. So, during the Civil War, you saw like the Iranian government backing Shia Hazara militants. You saw the Pakistani government backing Sunni groups in the country. And again, this has come up again now, right? And so the Taliban being majority Pashtun, and in the north of Afghanistan, there are Tajik groups that are fighting for their regions, specifically in Panjshir. There is kind of this revival of Pashtun versus Tajik versus Hazara, and you might hear these conversations. You might overhear these conversations. This is a photo of our beautiful Buddhas of Bamyan. Because Afghanistan is a Sunni Muslim country, there's also been conflict on the basis of religion. Shia Muslims have experienced persecution. There was a mass exodus of Jewish Afghans to Israel under the leadership of Zahir Shah. And because of decades of war, the indigenous Hindu and Sikh population has also fled Afghanistan. There's this preconceived notion that Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan are from India and they came into Afghanistan. No, they're indigenous Afghans. So while it's likely that the majority of your clients are going to be Sunni Muslims, it could be that you'll have clients from other religious backgrounds. And again, in this photo, you have, the pictures of our beautiful Buddhas of Bamyan, because Afghanistan was once a very Buddhist country. And unfortunately, they were destroyed by the Taliban. It's interesting because although religious intolerance is often cited as the reason for the statues being destroyed, the Taliban themselves have stated that they chose to destroy the Buddhas as a response to international sanctions. So during the time in which Afghans were starving to death, a delegation came into Afghanistan and asked the Taliban if they could restore the Buddhas. And the Taliban responded, well, restoring the Buddhas is not necessarily a priority right now. We have folks that are dying, but international sanctions were not lifted. And so in retaliation, the Taliban destroyed this, which was a horrible, horrible moment for us as Afghans. Okay, poll time. Poll time, and then we have a break. We have a break for about 5 minutes. So, which group has experienced heavy state-sanctioned persecution by the Afghan state? Hazaras, Pashtuns, Pashais, or Kabylis? And then if that second question is going to come up, I don't think it has yet. So let's go ahead and do that first one. we can even just go ahead and, answer that second one. It's fine. So it says, your Afghan clients come from varying religious sects. Which of the following will you most likely not encounter? The answer is Buddhists. We don't have, from our knowledge, we don't have any remaining Buddhist Afghans. Okay, awesome. Yes, the correct answer is Hazara folks. Unfortunately, Hazara folks have experienced heavy state-sanctioned persecution. Okay, so break time. Awesome. Okay, I want to be mindful of time because I know it's almost 11:20 and we're supposed to end here at 12, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A and going over the vignette. So I'm going to kind of whiz through the rest of this while still making sure that y'all get the vital information that you need. Okay. So the different waves of migration that I've spoken about, why is it important to know this? It's important to know this because there are existing Afghan communities that you can tap into should you need resources, right? So we talked about those different waves. And also, like, when we're talking geographically, there's a lot of Afghan folks in the Bay Area, a lot of Afghan folks in Alameda, as we know. But there's also a lot of Afghan folks in Virginia, Toronto in Canada. There's a sizable population here in Los Angeles as well. So, it's not like the folks that are coming right now are coming into a country that doesn't have some existing Afghan conferences, communities, resources, infrastructure, institutions and things like that. What are some common misconceptions that we as Afghans often hear? People think that we're Arabs and that we speak Arabic. So our script is an Arabic script. So the same way that like Spanish and English and like German all use, the same alphabet, we do use the Arabic alphabet like a lot of the Islamic world, but we don't speak Arabic. When we read the Quran, we're speaking Arabic, but we don't know what we're saying, right? Another misconception is that we're ethnically homogenous, that we're linguistically homogenous, that politically we're homogenous, so we all have the same ideas about, Afghan politics. Another misconception is that the burqa is an Afghan cultural dress. It is not. The burqa is actually an import from the Arab world. Although you will see in like really old paintings in the 1800s of like noble women wearing the burqa, but it's not an Afghan dress, that's Arab. The misconception that we're used to war and we're in a perpetual state of war. The misconception that we're all strict Muslims. It's possible that you'll meet, Afghans who don't identify as Muslim or who are not super adhering to it. That all Afghans are misogynist and are against social mobility for women. If that was true, then you wouldn't be seeing all these protests coming out of Afghanistan for folks who are really fighting for social mobility for women. Another big misconception is that Afghans planned 9/11 and that Afghans were the like pilots that that were the hijackers, that Afghans were hijackers in 9/11. So there were no Afghan hijackers and no Afghans were in the planning of 9/11. Afghanistan was merely used as the home base to plan it, unfortunately. And also when it comes to like identification of like Middle Eastern or Central Asian, Afghans differ on how they want to identify. I typically I'm okay when folks are like, oh, you're Middle Eastern, like that's fine for me to identify that way. Some people don't like it. Some people identify more as like South Asian or Central Asian, what have you. Also, it's important to note that some Afghans get really confused when they have to fill out like census paperwork and things like that in the States because we're white here, and that's really confusing for some folks. So I don't know how much y'all are familiar with the racial categorizations in the census, but Afghan people do fall under white. And so maybe wanting to explain to your clients that yes, there is an understanding that you're not white American, but this is just how you would identify. Hopefully the Biden administration will create a MENA category and a category that has Central Asian so that there is more visibility for our region. What are we actually? We are a nation of incredibly proud and resilient people with a very ancient and rich culture. The infamous poet Rumi is from what is now Afghanistan. The celebration of Nowruz has its origins in Afghanistan as it is a Zoroastrian religious holiday. Before the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan enjoyed some of the highest freedom of press rates, a reflection of how politically engaged and opinionated most Afghans are. And historically, women have had social mobility. Surprise, surprise, Afghanistan gave women the right to vote before America did. So the reality of Afghans and Afghan history is much richer than the 40 years of war, and being curious about that will definitely support you in building rapport with your clients. Let's talk about SIV folks. So SIV holders are Afghans who worked alongside the American forces. A lot of them worked as translators, but you will find people who are like cultural advisors, some people even doing like admin work or clerical work and things like that. They're not always people that were out like in the battlefields. Many SIV holders and their families are super vulnerable to retaliation from the Taliban because they're seen as traitors. And that's why it's imperative that like a lot of them get out of Afghanistan and get to a safe haven. It's often said that translators are the first to be killed. And so it's possible that SIV folks have been exposed to really traumatic events if they were out in the battlefield. So keeping that in mind. It's possible that because SIV folks are like in this weird contentious space of collaborating with the Americans and what have you, they might withhold information from you. So if you're a mental health provider and you're trying to do like a biopsychosocial or an intake, it's possible that an SIV person doesn't want to tell you information because they're still scared, right? It's kind of this culture of like not knowing what is safe and what can I share. Let's talk about rural Afghans. So the major cities in Afghanistan saw infrastructure being built, but foreign aid was so mismanaged and there was so much corruption in the country that the rural areas continued to be severely underdeveloped. There's this really great documentary called Turning Point, and it's on Netflix, and it's like a 5-part documentary. The last couple of parts talk about Afghanistan, and it shows how mismanaged all the funds were. So folks who lived in rural Afghanistan, it's possible that they've never used a Western working bathroom. It's possible that they're not used to corresponding electronically. I have my phone, I have my laptop, I have like everything, right? If somebody texts me, I'm gonna answer. For some Afghans, they don't use that. Like that's just not their method of communicating. Maybe they have a cell phone, but you know, it might be a better idea if you're trying to schedule things with you know, some Afghan folks, call them versus texting them. Don't assume that they know how to use email. You know, you just kind of have to gauge, right? It's also possible that in some communities, especially in the rural areas, there is like a strict separation of genders. So it's possible that some of your clients might not be used to a mixed gender environment. So just be mindful of that when you're approaching your clients. There's an Afghan proverb that I'd like to read for you. It states, "I lowered my gaze, but I did not bow my head. Even in love, I remained an Afghan." That quote can help you understand what the essence of being an Afghan is, right? No matter the ethnic group, Afghans are really proud people. It's a collectivist culture, as a lot of non-Western cultures are. There's a heavy emphasis on the family unit, the tribe, the ethnic group. And honor is a really big thing for Afghan folks. And this is going to impact your help-seeking behaviors. I'm going to give you an example. There was a group in Colorado, there was a social service agency in Colorado that I was consulting with. And they said, Medina, we have food pantries, but there's some families that are refusing to take anything out of the food pantry. We're offering it to them and they're not taking it, and we don't get it because we know that they're probably like, they're not on EBT, like we're not figuring out where are they getting their food. Well, what it was one, most of the food was not halal. Okay, so that was a big problem. The second problem was Afghans are so proud, they didn't want to take the food the first time it was offered. So that's how much of a proud people we can be. That doesn't mean this is always going to happen, but just keep that kind of in mind. And if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to plug my laptop in because I don't want to lose y'all. So keeping, you know, kind of that idea of honor in the back of your head. So this is like a little diagram showing the different tenets of Pashtunwali. And even though Pashtunwali is typically adhered to Pashtun culture, you will find that most Afghans kind of adhere to these tenets, right? So Melmasia, that means hospitality. Hospitality is huge for us. If you go into an Afghan client's home, even if they don't have anything, they're going to try to offer you something. It's respectful to take it, right? So typically, like for practitioners who have studied in a Western environment, we're taught to not receive gifts from our clients. But when it comes to Afghans, it's kind of seen as insulting if you don't take it. So, you know, if they're offering you water, drink the water. Nanawate refers to protection or asylum given to people against their enemies, which is why OBL was offered a safe haven in Afghanistan. Badal is the concept of seeking justice or taking revenge against a wrongdoer. So when Afghans are scorned, they feel like they want to take it within their hands to get justice, right? And so it's really important to remind your clients that they are operating within a Western framework, Western laws. There are consequences. It's not often that you like see Afghans taking justice into their own hands, but it can happen, right? Torah refers to bravery. So Pashtuns and Afghans in general are very proud of being brave. And Wafa refers to loyalty. So Afghans are very loyal to one another, and you will see this especially when you're working with families. Lone Survivor is a great movie, and it's a lesson in 2 of the tenets of Pashtunwali. It's basically a movie about an American soldier who is being hunted by the Taliban, and he seeks refuge with an Afghan village, and they protect him against the Taliban. All right, let's talk about the family structure in Afghan families. They're large and multi-generational. So you'll have like grandparents, parents, kids, their kids. They all might be living under one roof. Women typically move in with their in-laws at marriage, and adult children usually will stay at home. So like, I don't know, maybe for Tolo it was the same, but like for me, like I was the first one that moved out before I got married. My sister stayed at home until they got married. I only got to leave because I got into school. So you might see that with your clients. There's typically, you know, a patriarchal male at the head of the family. And because it's collectivist, they're going to be placing the family's needs before their own. And family matters are kept super, super, super private, right? So sharing personal information with outsiders is not super common. Women might open up easier to other women, and children will show a lot of obedience and reverence to their parents. And again, like I said earlier, they might show, you know, they might observe separation of genders. So if you're a practitioner, it's better if you are aligning women volunteers, you know, women identifying volunteers with women refugees and vice versa, right? So trying to just kind of reflect the genders of your clients and just keeping that in mind, that like, it's possible. Also just asking, right? It could be that like the families are totally fine with mixed genders, but it could be helpful that like if you're working with an Afghan client and she's a female, she might not be super comfortable working with a male and vice versa. Another thing that I suggest is if you're doing something like an intake and you want to observe confidentiality, we're typically used to like folks kind of we assume that folks understand what that is, and we'll do things like close doors and start to do our intakes, really over explaining to your clients. And I'm kind of talking from a mental health perspective right now, but explaining to your clients what you're doing, what the process is, and why you're doing it, right? So reminding them that like, I'm doing this to protect your confidentiality because I want you to feel like you have a safe space. This doesn't mean that you're like hiding information from your family. And if you choose to talk to your family about this, that is okay. I'm not going to be upset with you. So just kind of keeping that in mind, right? That like our ideas about confidentiality and individualism might not totally stick with your clients. Greetings. Between the same gender, typically they will shake with their right hand. Opposite genders typically don't touch. Some might be comfortable with, you know, shaking hands with the opposite gender. Men typically will put their hands on their chest and like bow, and that's their way of showing you respect. It's not typical that like an Afghan guy is going to put his hand out to shake it. It can happen, but typically this is the common kind of way to say hello. And then also after, like once you've built rapport, we kiss on the cheek 3 times. So it's kind of like the European, like chic, bougie, like, you know, French kiss or what? Well, it's not a French kiss, but you know, the way that folks in Europe do it, but we do it 3 times. Verbal and nonverbal communication. We kind of went over this a little bit. What you might see is children lowering their gaze. What does that mean? That means like I've worked with folks who are like, I'm trying to talk to this minor or this child, and they're not looking at me. They're just like looking down the whole time, and I can't get them to look at me. They're doing that because they're trying to show you respect. In our culture, like direct eye contact with an adult is seen as disrespectful. And so it's possible that like as they're talking to you, they're looking down a little bit and then looking back up and looking down a little bit. And that's just their way of showing you respect. It's not because they're trying to ignore you. Thumbs up is disrespectful in Afghan culture, surprisingly. So to us, this is kind of like the middle finger. It's possible that you will have Afghans who've just like adapted to the Americans being in Afghanistan, but this is typically a sign of disrespect. Also, try not to expose your feet or point your feet at someone. That's also seen as disrespectful. Speaking of feet, taking your shoes off before you enter the house. That's typically how Afghan folks will do it. Some other do's and don'ts. It's helpful to dress modestly. Wearing ripped jeans and short sleeves and shorts for women, I suggest against it. Like I said, most Afghans don't wear shoes in the home, so offer to take yours off. Use your right hand or both of your hands when you're offering something, because the left hand is reserved for cleaning and hygiene Islamically. Ask permission for photos, especially if you're working with women. I know a lot of like social service agencies and, you know, a lot of these orgs like to have photos to showcase the amazing work that they're doing, but just making sure that we're having like informed consent from the folks that we're working with. If you're a male presenting service provider, try your best not to inquire about an Afghan man's family member unless you've already built rapport. It can be seen as disrespectful. This one's kind of hard to navigate, especially if you like need vital information, but just kind of keep that in mind. Don't ask if an Afghan youth has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, because that's just not a thing in Afghan culture until you've assimilated. If you are providing a food pantry, making sure that there are a lot of halal options and that no pork is offered. And also if you have like a closet or a community space, having clean, appropriate prayer areas, and also giving access to like a bathroom or a place where Afghans can perform the Islamic ritual of like cleansing before they go to pray, which is called wudu. Wudu. Okay. Talking about Afghan hygiene. Like I said earlier, rural Afghans may not know how to use a toilet or a shower. They might not even use toilet paper. Why is that? Because a lot of Afghans use a bidet. A lot of Afghans in the West will go to Amazon and install a bidet. Some will have what kind of looks like, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's almost like a pot thing, like where you water plants, and they'll just fill that up with water and use that to cleanse themselves. So using water is seen as more hygienic for Afghans. So if you are building a community center, installing a bidet is going to do you wonders. Also, Afghans tend to eat on the floor. Like we'll put something, it's called a distarkhan, which is a really long, just kind of cloth that you put on the floor. And we like to eat with our hands. And we mentioned the bathroom before prayer. Hospitality. It's typical that you say no 2 times and you accept the 3rd time. Offer everything multiple times in return. If you offer something once, an Afghan person might say, no, it's okay, I don't need that, I'm fine. But they might be doing it out of modesty, even though they meant to accept it, right? So I'll give you an example, like, there's been times where I've worked with Afghan folks who are like I said earlier with the example with the Colorado folks, right? These folks are clearly hungry and they are very hungry, but they don't want to accept it the first time. So overextending it, almost almost like insisting on it, right? Like, no, like, I'm not going to let you leave until you have a bite to eat, something like that. Don't over compliment items in an Afghan household because they might just try to give it to you. It's like, oh, I really like that like ornament that you have on the wall. Here, it's yours. That's what Afghans will do. Insist that you appreciate the gesture, but you don't want to take it. Another thing is some Afghans are really superstitious. And so when you're complimenting something, saying mashallah after you compliment it. Afghans believe in the evil eye. Not all, but some Afghans believe in the evil eye, which is this concept that if you over compliment someone or if you notice something that is coveted in someone else, if you compliment it without saying mashallah, it will be damaged or it'll be ruined somehow. And so because of that, just kind of keeping that in mind. What are important times for Afghans? Ramadan is a very important time. It just finished. There's no food from sunrise to sunset, no, not even water. Make sure that your office has a space to pray. Avoid eating in front of clients, even though honestly, like most folks who observe Ramadan are fine with it, but I don't like to do it. And then also connect your clients to local mosques or Islamic community centers, because a lot of folks like to be involved in, the Islamic lectures and the Friday prayers and things like that. Nowruz is a really big deal for Afghans. The largest Nowruz celebration actually takes place in Afghanistan. You might know it as the Iranian or the Persian New Year. It's celebrated at spring equinox, but Nowruz is celebrated in communities from Albania all the way to China. And it's a really big part of Afghan culture. Even though it's not Islamic, it is kind of just like a big part of Afghan identity. And so it's always celebrated on the first day of spring, but you'll start to see the celebrations happen like a week prior. So keeping that in mind, if you're working with Afghan folks, remembering that Nowruz is going to be a really special time for them.
Medina, there's also something in the chat. Freddie was talking, you're talking about the evil eye. He was saying that's known as Nazar, correct?
Yes, that is known as Nazar. Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that. And now can I move this out of the way? Can y'all see the chat box? Oh wait, there we go. Okay. Yes, that is known as Nazar. Thank you for mentioning that. And so you'll see like a lot of Afghan households will have, am I wearing it? Oh yeah, I'm wearing my evil eye. So a lot of households might have that. Here are other important dates. The first couple of them are Islamic. And then the last two are just Afghan dates, right? So it's like the New Year and then our Independence Day. And this image is called Remnants of an Army. It's a pretty cool oil painting. It's one of my favorite oil paintings, and it depicts the last British soldier leaving Afghanistan after the Anglo-Afghan War. Quickly talking about Afghan mental health, keeping in mind that it's a country that's experienced 40 years of war. So you're going to have a lot of folks that present with PTSD, with anxiety, with depression. A lot of folks who are scared to talk about things because they experience so much like political persecution. All of these might manifest in somatic symptoms. So sometimes Afghans won't have the words, but they'll say things like my stomach hurts, or there's phrases like jigar khun or asab kharab. These phrases literally say, like, it literally refers to physical symptoms, but they're talking about mental ailments. There isn't really like a word for depression, right? So just keeping this in mind that overwhelmingly you are going to have folks that are presenting with mental health issues. Substance abuse has really skyrocketed over the past 40 years of war. Afghanistan is the #1 exporter of opium. Addiction rates have skyrocketed. In diaspora, what I have seen is a lot of Afghans don't see prescription drug use as addiction because they're like, oh, well, a doctor prescribed it, so how is it addiction? Like, I'm not doing street drugs. And then when someone is addicted, it's largely seen as a personal failure. So there's like a lot of taboo and a lot of stigma when it comes to admitting that somebody has a substance abuse issue. it can be helpful when you're communicating to your clients about substance abuse, describing it more as like a disease, right? So like using the medical model of addiction versus maybe the societal model. Once you kind of frame it in a way where it's like, no, this is a medical issue, your clients might click better for them. But they will be familiar with it because unfortunately, especially during the American occupation, there was a big jump in addiction. Suicide has unfortunately really increased. 80% of suicide attempts in Afghanistan are made by women. Islamically, suicide is considered a sin. So a lot of times families will not be forthcoming about somebody who committed suicide. Islamically, you can't perform the death rituals the way you're supposed to when somebody commits suicide. So it's really possible that families will cover it up, or they'll say that this person passed away for another reason. So just keeping that in mind as well. Other considerations, when you're doing your intakes, ask what language they speak. Maybe it's not Pashto or Farsi, ask what their ethnicity is. And we kind of went over a little bit of these before. Another big one is like Afghans are not as strict with time as Westerners are. So you might have like a 4 o'clock appointment and they might not show up until 5. And that just kind of is how it is. Don't like try your best not to schedule things on Fridays because Friday is considered a rest day. Afghans can be weird around dogs because dogs are considered unclean Islamically. And then we kind of talked about that last point here. So next we have a vignette. And in terms of like the way that we can tackle this, feel free just to get off mute and chime in. So Kais is a 24-year-old male refugee from Afghanistan. He arrived to the States 3 years ago under his father's SIV status. Lately, Kais has been using prescription pain medication regularly. He was prescribed this medication due to an injury he sustained from an explosion of a nearby landmine in his village. He lost 2 fingers on his right hand. Being unable to use his hand and experiencing pain from the injury, Kais feels he's not contributing to the family. His father is concerned he's abusing pain medication, but Kais doesn't agree, stating a doctor would not allow him to become an addict. What are some thoughts? What are some useful interventions? What can we talk about with Kais? What might be helpful for Kais? And please just feel free to get off mute. And chat is okay too. I'm going to open up the chat to see if anyone. Yeah, mental health services. Yeah, that's definitely one. What else can we connect Kais to? So earlier, right, connecting to support groups. That's a good one. And those support groups could be at a local mosque. Like a lot of mosques these days are not just places where people are going to pray, they're really community centers. And so connecting Kais to a mosque can be super helpful. Another thing, awesome. That's what I was just gonna say, finding other ways that he can contribute to the household. So because his right hand is the hand that's damaged, maybe, it's likely that he uses his right hand to read and write. What are other ways that he can contribute to the household that is thinking outside of, just him using his body? What else can he do? Let's talk a little more about his possible pill addiction. What can we think about that? He says his doctor wouldn't allow him to become an addict. Yes, Lita's saying that men feel their value comes from being a provider. Absolutely, and Afghan men especially. This is huge for Afghan men.
Maybe describing that there was a lack of honor in the placing of the landmine rather than it being anything dishonorable to have been affected by that, and that the guidelines of honor are different for Western medical doctors sometimes, and they may not always be aware of the effects of the medication that they're providing, and they may rely on people to tell them if something comes of it differently.
That's an awesome, awesome, awesome point. So what I'm hearing is, there's an over reliance on this idea that the medical professional is going to know everything. But just like you said, it could be helpful to talk to Kais and his family about, like, the doctor might not know that he's abusing medication, and these meds are not meant to be abused, but how can we, the best thing to do is to provide Kais and his family some psychoeducation about the abuse of pills, and that it's a big, big, big problem that we have in the West. I can say, like, from my family, what I've seen is an over dependence on pills because of this idea, right? Okay, if we don't have any more suggestions or any more discussions on that vignette and kind of thinking about time, other ways of supporting, linking folks to mosques, here are some Instagram pages for you to follow.
There were a couple more in the chat box.
Yes, of course. Let me open that up. Yes, so using cultural and religious background information to see the positive and how he can still contribute in so many other ways. Absolutely. I love that. That is absolutely correct. So even though, like, maybe you have this physical barrier that you're experiencing, there are still other ways that you can support this family, and kind of brainstorming with them on what that can be. Okay. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can see my chat. So yeah, so there are a number of resources that I have linked here. Also, what you are going to get is you're going to get some handouts for today's presentation. What they're going to be is, it's going to be some handouts on resources for, like, folks that are looking for citizenship pathways, some resources for SIVs. And there are also, I think, there's like one case study that you guys can look over, a case study of an Afghan woman who's experiencing mental health issues. And then also, yes, so there's the link to the PDF of the PowerPoint and the resources that Leah just put in the chat. So please go ahead and access that. And that's right. Thank you, Bishta, for mentioning the wellness helpline for Afghans. So in that link, there should be a PDF handout that is provided by the organization that is also running the wellness helpline for Afghans. Thank you all for joining today. I do want to just remind y'all that on May 18th, the First 5 Alameda will be providing another day of really, really awesome information. And so anybody who signed up for today's training will be getting information for that day. And so stay tuned for that. Also, me and Tola were talking about how when the initial Taliban takeover happened, there was not that many resources, and we've seen a really big jump in resources for Afghan folks. So, if you just literally just Google, like, Afghan refugee mental health in my area or something, you're going to see a lot more resources and things to support. Thank you all so much. If you want to connect with me, you can, go to Instagram at Breakfast and Beer. My email address is just my first name, last name with an extra K @gmail.com. Leadus wrote, Fremont has financial coaching and diary to connect families with resources in Fremont, Hayward, Union City, and Newark. Thank you so much for sharing that.
We have a little bit of time, about, less than 10 minutes or so. So I just wanted to see if we want to open the floor to some questions. Thank you again so much, Medina, for this wonderful presentation and information, tips, and things to think about as we work with our clients in the community. And so if there's any questions, now's the time to kind of share some thoughts or questions. And I think we have a hand up. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I wanted to actually ask, I'm not sure how to say, is it Beheshta, they might not agree to that you said about responding to the person who had been struck by a landmine. If you're still on the call, I was wondering if you would be willing to say more about that.
Yes, so I was connecting them to mental health services, psychologists, counseling. A lot of Afghans, they do not agree. They would kind of not want to be labeled as, as somebody who's kind of mentally not capable of handling situations. So every time when it comes, I'm a family resource navigator, and I usually work with Afghans who have a disabled child, children with disability or developmental delays, and especially the newly arrived ones. They're very hard to convince them that hey, we can connect you to services, and then they're like, then that kind of offends their honor. They're like, oh no, we don't want that. Nobody's sick here. Nobody's mentally retarded here. So they would kind of stamp anybody who would see a psychologist or accept mental health services. They would kind of label them as a sick person, a schizophrenia or something. That's why it's very, very hard to connect them to the right resources. So it takes a lot.
Thank you.
That's a really great point, Bishta. Thank you for bringing that up. Do you know, like, because so there's one family that I'm aware of and that I've worked with loosely, and what's been really helpful with this family who has an older son who's developmentally and physically disabled was, connecting them to the regional center, and they were able to see like so many other folks who were also experiencing developmental delays and who were also able to get so many resources. And so I tried my best to really normalize it for them and show them how many resources were available in the West, because I know in Afghanistan there's really not that many resources. Do you have suggestions for like what you've seen is helpful?
Yes, so we are right in between regional center and services, so that's where we kind of jump in and try to convince them that it's very normal, and that they should consider doing that. And there are so many Afghans who are entitled to disability services, and they would just reject, and they would say, no, we don't want that, And even though if they're low income, they would, just like the food pantry you mentioned before, they would not just accept free things from the state, just because they feel dishonored by doing that. And so that's why myself, Family Resource Navigators works with all kinds of families, African-American, Hispanics, but then I'm there to work with my own ethnicity and kind of, support them with that. And there are families who are very willing and thankful, but then there are other ones who don't even want to talk to you, even, but they're all Afghans. I've been thrown out of their houses a few times just for offering free services. And so, very resilient, and it's very hard. Like one time, I had a family who had a very hard situation. Their child was so sick at UCSF, and I did manage to ask for an interpreter to accompany them. And then it turned out that the translation services that was there was speaking Farsi, and the guy just refused, and then he left the appointment. And that was such an important appointment. We had it planned 6 months ahead. And then he called me, and then he was very mad at me. He said, "How could you?" He was from Iran, and we're not talking with Iranians. And I tried to kind of normalize, and then I said, well, it's because of your child, and in this situations, you do leave your political views on the side and just go ahead. And he said, no, I would never do that. So it's hard.
Yeah, there definitely are some barriers, and just like how you're talking about it, Afghans might have a really hard time admitting that their family member has a disability, or sometimes what I've seen is that person is just completely neglected and just like kind of forgotten, right? And so I think, as part of like our generation of Afghans, like Tolo and Bishta and myself, like providing this type of psychoeducation and materials in Pashto and Dari is so important, so that folks kind of just have a deeper understanding of it. But thank you so much for the work that you're doing, Bishta. That's like so needed.
So, what we do, we have a lot of brochures that does explain autism in Farsi, early childhood intervention, how you how you can detect like how to, that something is not okay with your child, that the developmental is not running smoothly, that they are not achieving their milestones on time. So when we kind of figure out, okay, the family really doesn't want to talk, so we just hand them those brochures, here, take it, share it with your family, let dad read through that, and if you think, you agree with anything of something, concerning, just give us a call back. And that helps a lot when they read it in their own language. Yeah, then it's very helpful.
Is there a link or somewhere that you can direct us to if we
Yes,
want?
I can share the link in the chat with you guys.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of more questions. I think Lydia had her hand up.
Hello, yeah, I actually have a question for Medina. So Medina, my family moved here when I was about 10 years old too. So I kind of went through this phase where like there were times in my life where you can't kind of figure out your identity. What am I? Am I Afghan? Am I American? Am I American Afghan? And there's a lot of newcomers that are coming, and I see them as well as their kids, especially the ones that have been here for a couple of years and they're still struggling. Do you get pushback sometimes when you're helping them, or does anyone on this group get pushback, especially like sometimes they think you're not Afghan enough or you've been too Americanized,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, but not necessarily. I mean, at least in my experience, it hasn't been pushed back in the sense where it's more me noticing the differences and them also acknowledging the differences, right? Like where it's very clear that I can't speak the languages fluently. And so I'm like over apologizing for that. But
Exactly.
yeah, so yeah, of course, like it's definitely a thing, but thankfully in my experience, it hasn't been to the point where I feel like I can't do my job, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we have a couple of comments in the chat too as well.
Yeah, there's one from Samira that says, I wonder about reframing trauma responses as not mental illness, but rather very protective ways the brain works to hold a big experience. And that story and that storytelling can help to optimize that strength, that response, and keep it as a strength. Yeah, I actually had a really positive experience doing something like this with my mom. And so my mom experiences a lot of PTSD and pretty severe depression. And I've had conversations with her about, talking to her about literally about neuroplasticity and about, the way our brains work. And, it makes sense that you have these responses. And she's been really, really positive to that. So I think that that is an awesome suggestion.
I think Danielle had her hand up too as well.
Hi, I want to thank you for this wonderful training, but also just ask. So I work for Healthy Families Alameda County, and we do things like ASQs and developmental screenings. Is there a way that I can explain the screenings without possibly offending the family or them not wanting to participate? The family I'm currently supporting, they speak Dari, and so I usually go through a translator when I'm working with them.
Mhm. Does anyone actually have suggestions for that? I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. Bishta is saying that there is ASQ in Farsi.
I'm thinking about emphasizing how every child is administered an ASQ, if that's true, just like part of a routine screening, as opposed to we think there's something wrong with your child.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a
Excellent.
good question.
Thank you. I appreciate the help, guys.
And Danielle, this is a hard conversation, I would say. There's
Mhm.
no possible way for a parent to not feel sad about that. So just like, maybe like there's a very big possibility of them not wanting to hear what you have to say, but they will think about what you're saying afterwards. So whatever you say to them, it's going to be playing in their mind and it's going to help them decide what they're going to do next.
Right.
I also think what could be helpful is like talking about it from like a strength-based perspective. So talking about like, this can be so helpful. And the reason that we do this is because it can provide more resources, or it can empower you to like understand your child better or whatever it is.
Mhm.
So talking more about like the benefits of doing something like this, it could be like, oh, you know, there never used to be these screenings, but what we've seen is that doing these screenings really supports these children that just think differently, you know, or talking a little bit about neurodivergency and kind of helping to normalize that like not everybody learns the same way. And so emphasizing more of like how great this could be. If that makes
Okay,
sense. Yeah.
excellent. It does. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for the great presentation.
Yeah.
And Danielle, just to add to this, you're welcome to email me for the ASQ in Farsi, like I could find out from one of our colleagues for more information on that. So
Okay,
you're welcome to email me.
thank you.
I was also just thinking, sorry, Danielle, one more thought about emphasizing the academics part of it a little bit, like Medina was saying, but how maybe this is a tool for finding out how we can best help your child to learn in school, as opposed to even thinking about primarily the mental health aspect.
Excellent. Thank you.
Looks like we're about the end of our presentation. And thank you for such an engaging conversation, and thank you for the tips as well, and all the resources. So I just want to thank Medina Wardak for a beautiful presentation today. And I want to thank you all as well for joining in on us on this presentation. Again, you'll be receiving an evaluation, so we do appreciate the feedback. We look forward to seeing you folks on our May 18 presentation with more resources to come. And again, thank you again and have a nice day.
Bye everyone. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for all the work you're doing.